It is spring in the Wichita Mountains of Oklahoma. A light rain falls. The mists wander like lost clouds over oak and stone and living prairie. There is a stillness in this vast, natural garden of solitude and deep silence. But something extraordinary resides within this sanctuary, something that makes the land come alive with majestic voices and the thunder of wolves. In the wild side of Eden. The Wichita Forest and Game Preserve was designated in 1905 by President Theodore Roosevelt for the preservation of the near-extinct bison, also commonly referred to as the buffalo. Now known as the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge, it ranks as one of the oldest preserves on Earth, set aside for the preservation of wildlife and endangered species. This refuge is a unique province of wild lands, encompassing some 60,000 acres of hardwood forests, rugged mountains, and wilderness habitat. In fact, it contains the largest expanse of protected mixed grass prairies in the United States. Approximately 1.7 million visitors come here each year to experience the natural environment and to observe the bison, elk, and longhorn that abound here. Three great animals that might have disappeared from the southern Great Plains if it had not been for the refuge. All three critical components of American history. When Lewis and Clark made their historic expedition into the American West, it is estimated as many as 60 million bison roamed the plains. Elk ranged from the Southwest into Canada and from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Several decades later, large herds of Texas longhorns moved northward, as many as 10 million head, from Texas to Kansas along the cattle trails. But something happened as America raced toward the 20th century. The hide and market hunters came for the bison. Elk, once the most widespread of all American hoofed animals, were hunted and slaughtered for their meat and antlers. By 1880, the bison was on the verge of extinction. The elk had been driven from most of its ancestral range, and the longhorn's day was nearly done. At the turn of the 20th century, only a few bison survived, mostly in Wild West shows and zoos. Yet, Oklahoma offered a glimmer of hope. It was July 4th, 1901. In a month, the Oklahoma Indian Territory would be opened for settlement. At the last minute, President McKinley signed a proclamation setting aside 60,000 acres of the Wichita Mountains as a forest and game preserve. The wild, natural lands were saved from the settlers and from the plow. Here was prime country, just waiting, it seemed, for bison. But just where would the bison come from? It was during this time that a new conservation ethic began to emerge, and President Theodore Roosevelt was at the forefront of these efforts. Teddy said this of the bison: "It would be a real misfortune to permit the species to become extinct." Roosevelt and William T. Hornaday, director of the New York Zoological Park and president of the newly formed American Bison Society, were the first leaders to push for the preservation of the bison. A handful of ranchers had witnessed the slaughter of bison, and in 1876 initiated their own efforts to save the animal by capturing what bison they could find. Then, in 1907, Roosevelt and Hornaday had 15 bison moved from the New York Zoological Park. They were loaded into crates and shipped by rail to the newly formed refuge.
The Great Spirit's cattle return, and it was a very moving thing because this was a religious thing for them. These old warriors were crying, telling their children and their grandchildren of the old days and of the Great Spirit's cattle. Tears running down. It was very, very moving because the buffalo had returned.
Following the slaughter of the bison, the market hunters needed to fill the demand for meat and turned their sights on a different species, the elk. Thousands upon thousands of elk were killed on the Great Plains. The last native elk of Oklahoma was killed in 1888. Only in Montana and Wyoming were the elk protected. It was the Rocky Mountain elk from the Jackson Hole herd that were reintroduced to the refuge in 1911.
After they established the buffalo and the elk and some of the other animals that were indigenous to the area, they became concerned about the old Texas longhorn. They were fast disappearing, almost gone, and that they should be preserved because they were so important to the history of this area and to the west.
In the mid-1920s, Forest and Game Preserve staff, armed with descriptions of the longhorn type, initiated their search in Texas and Mexico. After inspecting some 30,000 Texas cattle, 30 animals were selected as seed stock for preservation. Congress then passed a proclamation stating that the longhorn's new home would be the Wichita Forest and Game Preserve, even though longhorns are not considered a game animal. Today, the WR brand Texas Longhorn bloodlines are truer to type than any other herd in America. And the refuge bison herd is considered the seed stock for many herds across the United States. Since the bison and longhorn herds have prospered so well, they are threatening to outstrip the carrying capacity of the land. Each year, the refuge rounds up excess animals and prepares for the fall auctions.
Things down considerably.
The bison roundup requires a tremendous amount of planning and patience from the modern cowboy.
You know, I've been here for 15 roundups now, and the first one was back in the time when we used the helicopter. And we had vehicles, several older four-wheel drive vehicles that were expendable to some extent because they usually got damaged, and horseback dogs. You know, we've used a lot of different things. We've kind of shifted to using, you know, the alfalfa cubes as bait, and we kind of lure them into the smaller pastures from the big pasture. You know, we've got a 35,000 acre pasture.
The method that we actually round up animals is a lot better for the animal. They're definitely, you can tell by watching them, their stress levels are a lot lower than in years past with the other methods.
The refuge approach to managing the bison herd is to maximize gene diversity and to minimize gene loss. This is accomplished by DNA testing each animal as it is run through the corral system.
Don't push it that far, Tony.
Keeper cow.
The DNA samples are then prepared and sent to a lab for analysis. This information, along with other factors such as age and sex, determines which animals will be auctioned. The Bison Auction is the area's social event of the year, attended by buyers from throughout the United States. Among those bidding on the animals are a number of Native Americans who take the animals back to tribal lands for ceremonial purposes or as seed stock for tribal herds.
I'm a member of the Loyal Shawnee tribe, and we conduct a buffalo dance ceremony every year in the fall. And it is out of respect and loyalty to the animal that at one time sustained us and kept us alive, and now we're trying to help take care of it.
One of the basic principles of ecology is that everything in nature is connected, including things that seem to have nothing in common at all. A case in point, the enormous bison and the tiny prairie dog. This little dog is known as a keystone species, a species that is key to the very existence of the entire western grasslands ecosystem. The prairie dog aerates the soil, providing vegetation for the bison's diet. It is also a main food source for predators. Although the refuge is known for its role in saving the bison, Texas longhorn, and the reintroduction of the elk to the southern plains, it is also the stage where the fate of the diminutive and endangered black-capped vireo is being played out. Once common on the Great Plains, this tiny bird was almost eliminated from Oklahoma, with fewer than 40 individuals nesting on the refuge in the early 1980s. Through current conservation efforts and the use of better science, refuge populations now top over 4,500 pairs. A true endangered species success story. Fire is as much a part of the natural prairie habitat as the bison and the prairie dog. Like the black-capped vireo, the refuge has worked to restore fire to the landscape. There are two types of fire on the refuge: wildfires sparked by human error or lightning, which can rage out of control, and prescribed fire set intentionally to meet specific management objectives.
We start getting winds, we can let it just die down, because all of our winds are going to be pushing it back into the black.
Refuge fire personnel regularly use prescribed fire as a management tool to reduce the fuel that can cause damaging wildfire and help maintain a diverse, healthy, and vigorous ecosystem. To see the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge is to take a journey back in time, back 100 years or more, to a time when America was young and great herds of bison thundered across the horizon, to distant seasons before the prairie had known a plow, and the haunting bugle of the elk echoed from the ridges, to a time when all life was connected and the laws of nature were absolute. The Wichitas are, as they were then, a garden for the senses. Beautiful, natural, pristine, and above all, wild.